Okay, so this is the second week of lectures. Hopefully it's not too loud. We've got multiple people working virtually from the same household. So we left off yesterday talking about what would it look like if we paid athletes in the NCAA. So we'll talk about a few of the issues that exist there, a little bit more of the labor market today. Let's just jump into it. So if we think about the value, right? If we're thinking about how much should athletes be getting paid, I mean, the first thing we need to understand is that demand for labor, right? We know there will be a supply for labor. It's probably similar to that of the pros in terms of if it's the only place I can play, I'm willing to supply my labor to for the same amount of money I would if I could supply it to the professional leagues. So the demand curve for labor is made up of the marginal revenue per win and the marginal number of additional wins that player brings in. We've talked about this before. So if we just kind of think about the average revenue, and this isn't a real perfect way of estimating what that demand would be, but if we look at the average revenue for football across these Division I FBS programs or FCS, it's about $32 million is the average revenue. So the total number of football players in scholarship is 85. So if 48% of the revenue, right, went to players, and we're getting that 48% from the NFL. So currently the NFL, 48% of revenue goes towards player salaries. Then if we took 48% of 32 million, divided that by 85, we would get how much each player could be worth. And that's if we're just paying everyone the same amount, right? So we're thinking about constructing a universal wage, not allowing a completely free and open labor market, but offering one wage to college players, here specifically college football players. If we did that, we get about $180,000. Okay? Now, if we do this for basketball, you kind of see the average revenue is a little bit lower, but there's far fewer players on scholarship. If we took the NBA, once again, pretty similar, 48 versus 50%, we'd get a very similar wage for basketball players as well, a little bit higher. So if we tried to have this wage, we tried to institute this wage, let's say we look at this data and say, okay, you know what? If we could choose a wage that applied to both football and basketball, let's say we pay every player $180,000, right? Well, the problem with this is what happens in other sports, right? So if we think about we had a kind of a universal wage and we have this minimum wage set, such NCAA players have to get paid this wage, what would be kind of the problem with that? So, there we go. So let's say that's what we did here. Let me see if we can get this. Where's the best place for me to be? Probably right here. Hopefully the glare is not too bad. So we've got our quantity for labor. We've got our wage up here. Right. Let's say we have the same supply of labor, no matter what the sport. So let's say we've got the demand curve for labor. Right. So if we just allowed a free and open labor market, the wage would kind of settle right here, right? So we call this W star. If we're going to pay every player like the same amount, and we said let's set it at, I'll do an example here. Let's say I set it at 180,000, and for whatever reason that's below what the equilibrium wage would be. Well, if this demand curve for labor, let's say this is for football. Okay. If instead we think about, okay, that's fine. In fact, if we set that, they'd easily pay the 180,000. In fact, they would pay up to this amount. They pay an even higher amount. Or you can think about at this quantity of labor supplied, the teams would be willing to pay up to this amount. Right? Now, that's all fine and well for football and basketball programs, but what happens if you have a sport that has a much lower marginal revenue per win, and I think I'm going to pick on lacrosse here. All right, so they have much lower demand curve for labor, similar supply curve. Well, the problem there is at this minimum wage, not even the first unit of labor, not even the first worker or first player here would actually be hired. So you'd actually end up with, if you instituted this as the NCAA kind of wage for all sports, well, we can't use what it is for football and basketball, and it doesn't make sense, right? The demand is much higher. So we'd have to institute a much lower minimum wage that, yeah, at that point, maybe if we kind of said lowered it down to here, well, now it's no longer binding for lacrosse, although it does kind of force it, at least they'll be paid this. But for sure, if it's not binding for lacrosse, it's not going to be binding for these higher sports as well. So it's going to be very difficult to kind of just pay one wage. We probably are going to have to make this sport specific, right? Even between basketball and football here, we can see that there would be a difference. Not only is there a difference among sport, right? What is there also going to be a difference in terms of the demand for labor? Well, the demand for labor comes from not only the marginal revenue per win, but even within the same program or the same sport, the marginal wins added by a player is different. So for higher quality players, it's going to be a similar sort of a problem. The demand for them will be much, much higher. So if we try to set a minimum wage that players can get paid, well, it's not going to be binding for these higher paid players. And if we put it too high, the players where there's a low demand for, maybe like bench players, it's not profitable for the team to carry those players. So we might see rosters actually go down. Okay. So if we discriminate in terms of what type of sport, right? We kind of already looked at this on the graph, that it's going to matter the type of sport in terms of what we want to set this wage for college athletes at. Well, if we looked at all sports, the kind of average total revenue is 44 million. The average number of players on scholarship is 567. So if we instead look at it not just basketball and football, but all sports, well, then we get a wage that looks like it's a little bit more reasonable or comparable, around $40,000. Right? That's if we took all the money generated from every athlete and divided it evenly among all athletes. Right? So if we do that, it's likely that we're underpaying some of our basketball and football players, but we're overpaying probably some of our kind of lower level sport programs. Like I picked on lacrosse, but whatever sport you want to choose there. What if we don't include, right, colleges or what if we look at any college, so not just FBS and FCS, but any school? Notice the average total revenue falls from. So this includes schools like like Wabash Community College, or not community, Wabash College, or trying to think of other Indiana schools that we could think about, like DePaul, things like that. Well, then we see the average total revenue falls to 3.4 million because so many of these non-FBS or FCS schools are earning such low amounts of revenue. So then if we look at the kind of college sports as a whole and the average number of people across all schools, 281, now we're down to a wage of about $6,000. Notice this wage of $6,000 is probably comparable, maybe even lower than tuition at some of these schools. So we had to think about, if we allow there to be, if we kind of just treat all sports the same, we've got a problem, right? Because we're going to end up with a relatively low wage if we say that every college athlete gets $6,000. That's not going to solve people's complaint that college basketball and football players are vastly underpaid by just receiving a scholarship, because if we give them the wage, they're going to be vastly underpaid still as well. So it doesn't really solve the issue if we treat every sport the same. So what's a model in which we could kind of account for the demand differences, not only amongst or across sports, but also across even teams, right? If we think about the marginal revenue per win driving the demand curve for labor, the marginal revenue per win is going to be higher at a school like Alabama than it would be at a school like Savannah State, right? And so, just to kind of go here to a little board here, we're thinking about, just kind of as a reminder, what's driving these demand curve differences. Now, it doesn't have to be lacrosse versus football. It could be Alabama versus Alcorn State, right? Well, for Alabama, marginal revenue per win is much, much higher, which drives that demand curve up, which means that the equilibrium wage that Alabama would pay much higher than the equilibrium wage that a smaller school would pay. Right? So, thinking about these differences not only across schools, but even across sport, what's a model specifically for differences across sports that would allow us to pay players, and we could see different wages at different schools such that players are being paid closer to an amount that's equal to their margin, the value of their marginal product of labor, or the value of the marginal wins that they're bringing in. Well, the model kind of already exists for us, specifically at the collegiate level, which is graduate students, right? So graduate students are offered a wage, right, or assistantships or fellowships, right, in order to receive tuition remissions. So you could still offer athletes tuition remissions. You could still offer them annual stipends, just like you do doctoral programs or some master's programs like this. We have, even here at Ball State, some GA positions for different programs. So you can offer stipends and tuition remissions. Now, usually for graduate students, that stipend is because you're also doing some work for professors, whether it's research or whether it's being a teaching assistant. For the athletes, all you're expecting is that they put time and effort into practice and kind of playing these games. And so you could still offer them stipends. And if we had to go out there and look, you could Google this right now if you wanted to prove it to yourself. But what's likely true about an engineering doctoral assistantship versus a history doctoral assistantship? Well, the engineering program offers much higher assistantships, right? Because they know in order to get, one way in which you can attract people to go to graduate school and not stay out kind of in the private sector, well, if you go to graduate school, you're foregoing a lot of wages, like high wages if you're an engineer, while as the wages you're foregoing as a history undergrad probably aren't as great. And so for programs where they can generate a much higher additional amount of revenue, right, from having you there, the annual stipends could be higher, right? So for whatever sports program generates more revenue, they could offer higher stipends. So football could offer higher stipends than, say, lacrosse or golf, right? So the model's kind of already there, and we could allow this to kind of vary across these departments. Like I already mentioned, I didn't say history, I said sociology on the slides. Same sort of idea would apply. Okay. So, what are some additional issues we might need to think about if students became employees, right? Well, a couple of them would be labor laws that could change the hours a player could work. So right now, I might have already mentioned in this class, I've talking to Division I football players during the football season. I would venture to guess they're working far more than 40 hours a week between workouts, practice, watching tape, kind of all the watching tape more, the requirements that are on them during the football season are going to drive their hours way, way up. So if there's any limit, right, that our labor laws have, they're now subject to those labor laws. And if they work more than 40 hours a week, well, then we might have to pay kind of overtime, right? And so there's some issues we would have to think about there. Because the NCAA or NBA and NFL have established minimum age requirements, this is going to kind of the NBA is getting rid of this, but it still applies to the NFL. That if you can't go to the NFL right away, well, if we got rid of these, like in the NBA, right? Because if we start to pay players in the NCAA, there's some antitrust issues with now the NCAA is the only employer if we have these kind of minimum age requirements that really the NCAA and NBA and NFL have kind of made together because it's in both parties' best interest. Well, if they're subject to antitrust laws and these minimum age requirements go away, what's going to happen is more players will then go to the professional level as opposed to stay at the collegiate level. So this is going to decrease our labor supply for higher talent, which if there's a lower supply of high quality players at the NCAA level or collegiate level, we could think of this as a supply curve decrease. So this is pretty easy to think about what impacts that would have on their wages. So the demand is going to remain unchanged at the collegiate level for these high quality star players. But, so here's wages. Let me see how I can get this. There we go. So you've got this demand curve for labor. Here is the initial supply. But if it's subject to antitrust laws and they then have to get rid of these minimum age requirements at the professional level, supply decreases. So we can think about the new equilibrium wage would be higher for the players that remained in the NCAA, right? So these high quality players could be good. We're going to see them being paid higher amounts at the collegiate level. What's the next thing I have here? So we see higher wages but a fewer number of equilibrium players would kind of be paid there, or would be not paid, would be we would see exist at the collegiate level. The NCAA also restricts roster size with the number of scholarships they allow. So if this is eliminated, potentially see an increase in labor supply, which would kind of decrease wages and increase the number of players. Now, when we think about the labor market and the demand curve for labor, right, it's likely very different for our star quarterback relative to our bench players. So really, this impact of the scholarships is likely only going to impact those kind of lower quality bench players. But if that's eliminated and it increases the labor supply, right, because it's not kind of censored at a certain amount of scholarships, we might see lower wages for bench players kind of overall, and then just a higher number of bench players carried on a team. Okay? All right, so we can also think about if we had wages negotiable, the number of games would increase the pay that players would require. So if we wanted to play, say, instead of 12 games, they want to increase it to 14. You'd have to pay those players a higher wage to play those additional 2 games, right? You can also think about that if we wanted to win a higher number of games, the marginal cost of each additional win is going to be higher, because if the marginal cost is no longer 0, I talked about yesterday, where if giving a player a scholarship, if they wouldn't have went to the school otherwise and they're not displacing another student, the marginal cost is essentially 0, right? Because you're not out anything. If you didn't give them the scholarship, they wouldn't have went there, so you wouldn't have been making any money. So there's no opportunity cost. Essentially, the cost is 0. Well, now if you're paying them additional wages, now the marginal cost is no longer 0. It's going to be something positive. And so now if you want to win each additional game, you're going to have to spend money on additional talent. We no longer have this 0 kind of marginal cost for our labor. It's going to be something higher, right? So this would predict that potentially there's kind of a lower number of equilibrium games that would be optimal for these leagues to play. So currently the number of teams that we have in NCAA is limited, so 250 in football, 350 in basketball. A free and open labor market would allow teams to enter and exit more freely. Potentially, right, it drives supply up. There's a huge demand for these sports. We see that we're no longer censored at a certain amount. We would see a higher number, potentially an increase in the overall total number of games played. Right? And this is just because there's no longer would be these kind of limitations on the number that we would have to see in each league. Okay? So what are some of the other impacts we would see? And I might take a step back here in just a second and go back to that slide to mention something when I'm kind of using the board. But if we had a free labor market, it would increase wages for some, right? It would allow for star players probably to be paid a much higher wage than what the value of their current scholarship is, right? Because the number of additional wins, the marginal wins of labor for those star players is much higher. Players on bigger programs where you have higher marginal revenue per win, similar idea. The demand curve for that player is much higher and would likely increase wages for players on those big programs, even potentially bench players. However, you could actually see a decrease, and I probably should put in quotation mark, wages for others, because for backup players, even potentially on large teams, lower quality or on small programs, all of those things would push the demand curve for labor much, much lower. If we just allowed them to be paid wages and they were no longer offered scholarships, for some of them, the actual value of the wage they would be paid is probably much, much lower than the value of the scholarship they were currently receiving. Specifically at small schools where tuition's high. So you can look at a lot of these, like I mentioned earlier in Indiana, DePaul, Wabash. Their athletic programs often offer tuition remission to their players, right? Their student athletes, and the value. Some of their tuition, $20,000 plus a year. Well, if we look at equilibrium wages, remember we said even if we include all schools, we're only at $6,000. If we only looked at those small quality programs, this wage is going to be much, much lower than $6,000. That's going to be less than the value of the scholarship they were currently receiving. Where did I go? Here we are. Another problem that would exist is, well, what schools are going to be able to pay the highest wages and attract the highest quality players? It's going to be kind of the already higher revenue generating programs, and so they're going to be able to gain get the high quality players, improve their quality even more, and it's going to the lower quality teams aren't going to have as much money, not be able to pay high quality players as much, so they won't get the high quality players. It's going to drive competitive balance across leagues to be even worse, right? And even within conference, it would drive it to be worse, where the higher revenue generating schools within the conference would be able to increase their quality more than the lower revenue generating. And also, okay, this here is what I wanted to kind of draw you a picture of. So smaller programs may not be able to operate with higher labor costs, causing them some to exit, right? So if I require you to pay your players, right? If it's not an either or thing, right? I can't offer them scholarships or wages. I can offer them both, but I have to at the very least pay them a wage, right? So what is that going to look like? Well, right, this is a model we've probably haven't looked at in a while, right? We're stepping away from the labor market, and we're thinking about what would this athletic program, athletic department, let's say we're just thinking about their football program, and we're thinking about these small not quantity of labor, sorry. I'm off the thing. So we'll do quantity, so number of games here. So this is the quantity or the number of games. All right. We've got kind of dollars here. We can think about the price of those games. We could put a price on it. Oh, I got a better autofocus here. Maybe once I get these up out here, that'll be good. So let's say we had a kind of somewhat simplistic model. We have demand. We have some monopoly power from the teams, so they have this marginal revenue curve they face. There we go. Is that better? There we go. So let's just say we have a simple marginal cost where it's something above zero, but it's constant. We pay every player the same amount. And then originally, average total cost looks something like this. Maybe before this was the marginal cost, we weren't paying players. Let's assume we weren't paying players, but it was whatever it cost to support the team in terms of buying jerseys, housing, I don't know, equipment, things like that. So we have this average total cost curve. Maybe we look at where's the profit maximizing point. Well, it's where marginal cost equal marginal revenue. You kind of see here at that quantity, price and average total cost. Price is above average total cost. So one equation we haven't really looked at is profits are actually, we can calculate with price minus average total cost times quantity when we have a linear demand curve. All right, so it gives us a way to think about these profits. So as long as price is greater than average total cost, that implies that profits are positive. Okay? So what happens if now it's not just the cost to kind of supply jerseys, to pay workers at the stadium to supply these games, but what now if it's now includes some additional cost to pay the players, right? So you have this new marginal cost curve. Right? It's a little bit higher, which is also then going to force our average total cost curve to be higher. Well, now where's the optimal point? It's going to be a little bit lower. And if we go up, right, to what that price would be, looks like the price is going to be very similar to what it was before, but average total cost, much, much higher. Whoops. See if I can get this to focus a little better. There we go. So if I look at the new price minus average total cost times quantity, the new average total cost is much higher than the price, and so profits would actually be less than zero, driving that team, I'll leave this up for a second, driving that team kind of out of the league. Here the league being the NCAA. Okay? And if you're kind of watching this video after I post it, you can kind of pause there, hopefully a little bit longer. If you have any questions over what was on the slides, if it's not quite clear, I know that I don't have the best webcam and it doesn't autofocus perfect. So if you have any questions over what's written there, please email me or feel free to ask if you are watching it kind of live. Okay? All right. So that kind of covers our last bullet point there. When you think about some other impacts that this would have, I kind of already talked about this, but if I have high revenue generating sports, um, then it's really, the NCAA is really just going to start to look like the professional leagues, right? You're probably going to have a lot of these programs trying to profit maximize. Um, they're going to pay players subject to a free and open labor market, uh, which would be fine. It would just generate, basically a competing league. Now, what's one thing that could be good? Well, this is almost, if it's like a competing league, what would it get rid of? Well, the league and the NCAA essentially right now had monopsony power. Right? So if I now have two leagues that can compete for young talent, and look, maybe the benefit to the player is higher at the professional level, but I think you could argue that if you were able to be paid high wages, Alabama, in terms of the revenue they generate, could potentially offer just as high of wages to players as some of the lower market, smaller market teams in the NBA or NFL. And I see Alabama, so it should be NFL football. That was the example I was saying. So if you get comparable wages, you might have some players choosing to stay in NCAA instead of going to NFL. You've now got competing leagues for those young aged players, right? Because we still would not have players eligible more than 4 or 5 years at the collegiate level. But it could reduce monopsony power, which if we reduce monopsony power, we've talked about before, that's going to, monopsony power, essentially lowered wages. So if we get rid of that, it would result in higher wages not only for the professional leagues, but also clearly at the NCAA level as well. It could be then that lower revenue generating programs probably operate like they do now. They're just they spend money and they just try to break even, right? They're win maximizing. They're not trying to generate profits. They're just generating as much revenue as possible, spending all the money they have up until the point where profits are equal to zero. And it could be if they were given the option. We already mentioned a lot of them couldn't offer, the equilibrium wage wouldn't be higher than the value of their current tuition. And so if the equilibrium wage isn't higher than the value of their current tuition, instead of offering wages, they would just offer their players scholarships, right? So, we would see different behaviors depending on how much revenue, oops, I can get my mouse here, how much revenue the school or the sport was generating. Now we might have some demand concerns. So in all this discussion, one thing that we've left out, I've assumed that demand hasn't changed for the product, right? Well, it could very well be that consumers have different utility functions when it comes to professional versus collegiate sports, right? Professional sports consumers tend to, and we've talked about this, care about competitive balance. Maybe competitive balance actually isn't as much of a driver in terms of especially regular season games, right? It may very well be, but at the collegiate level, maybe they care more about winning than they do about seeing a good game. They just like to see their team win, right? And I've never seen anyone kind of estimate the differences between professional and collegiate sports. That would be actually kind of interesting to see if at the level of kind of competition, we could look at betting lines and see if that impacts the number of, or the attendance, something like that. But it also may be that the demand curve for college sports, one of the factors there that isn't part of the function for demand for professional sports could be just this love of the game aspect, where these players aren't being paid, and that's why I like to watch it, because I feel like there's something, some additional grit, or there something there where they're not playing for money, and so I find it more enjoyable to watch that. That could be part of it. So if we allow players to be paid, that may actually reduce the demand overall, lowering the marginal revenue per win for every school, lowering the demand curve for labor, and lowering the equilibrium wages that these players could potentially earn. So that's another thing we would have to think about when opening this labor market up. I have this, and I won't go too much into this, but we also would have maybe some Title IX concerns. Currently, excess profits made in sports, likely from certain programs, will subsidize scholarships for other sports or even other scholarships within a school. With the exception of some women's basketball programs, right? There's really only two high revenue generating programs sports at different universities, which is men's basketball and football. If we see any decrease in profits because of higher labor costs in these two sports, that means there's less money available to subsidize other programs. If there's less money available to subsidize other programs, we're going to have to start cutting some of our other sports programs. If Title IX has to be met, well, we always have to have an opposite gender sport kind of. We can't just like cut the lowest revenue generating programs at the say 2 or 3 lowest or female sports. We have to kind of cut back and forth, like cut one male, one female, so on and so forth. The free and open labor market, if we allowed each sport, especially specifically each sport by gender, to be paid differently, I mean, it might be that a lot of these women's programs aren't generating enough revenue. They're not going to be able to pay the high wages required to these NCAA athletes, and some of them may just go out, right? We may see fewer female sports exist because now that there's a free and open labor market, men's football and basketball no longer have any money to subsidize, and not just female sports, but like I said, I mean lower revenue generating male sports as well. It's just we don't have large female football and basketball programs, and so ultimately there will be more kind of female sports affected by this. Right? Additional concerns that we have to think about: health insurance costs. Wages don't capture everything, right? The value of a job is not only wages. Talked about this a little bit the other day. It's wages plus utility from other things. Well, potentially, it's wages plus not just utility from these other measurables, but also the value of the benefits you receive, health benefits. We can think about also there's this kind of binding. If you have more than 50 employers, you have to provide them health care. Well, for sure, if we don't even treat the athletic department as one entity and we just treat each team, every football team is going to have to pay this, right? Would have to pay these additional costs, health insurance costs. So I don't know. I like to think about paying the players. We can try to think about every little aspects and direct and indirect effects of allowing these schools and programs to pay their players, and this would be one of the additional concerns we'd have to think about as well. Okay, so that is kind of the end of what I have for our slides in terms of material. The next thing that we'll kind of go over is what would be our weekly reading, and hopefully this is a little helpful for you guys to kind of go through your project. So tomorrow, Thursday, Friday, my goal is to just work on getting you guys data for these projects. I know there's been a huge delay in this. It's not what I wanted either. So there was a date where you could turn it in early and I would get it back to you. I'll actually kind of change that to be, let me look it up here real quick. Really, whatever, 2 Fridays. So it was supposed to be this Friday. I think it would now be April, if this pulls up. And I'll post an announcement about this on Canvas. That's going to be easier to do on my phone. So if you turn it in by April 10th, I'll actually kind of read those, grade them, and get them back to you as soon as possible. All right. So April 10th instead of March 27th, if you get those projects to me. So I'll start churning out the data the next couple of days to get everyone their data sets. And we might even have a couple class periods online here where I don't do any lecturing. I just have an open time slot where you can come in and ask questions, or we can kind of Skype if that's better. You can email me specifically or individually and set up a specific time where we could Skype and talk about where you're at in the project and what you do with the data set that I've given you. Okay, but we still have to talk about this paper. I will put up a weekly quiz, and we'll have questions over this, so it'd be a good thing to kind of pay attention to. So the general question was, does color or does race affect the evaluation of others' performance, right? Specifically in the context of NBA referee foul calls. So this is a good example where there is a general question, right? This doesn't have to necessarily be specific to sport, but then we use a sport-specific setting to understand this question, right? Is there discrimination going on? So we talked, in lecture about employer-employee consumer discrimination. But what if there's discrimination within the play of game, right? That's interesting as well. So this paper looked at 12 plus years of data. We had black and white players, and we look at the averages. We see really similar number of fouls per game. However, that's not telling the whole story, because if we look at the average time played, right, white players have on average across the league 3 minutes less. Right? So if I think about if we're playing, if I see white players, I shouldn't say if we see white players playing less time, right? And we are seeing black players play 3 more minutes, but they're both getting the same number of fouls, the white players are actually getting called a higher number of fouls kind of per minute played. Right? And so maybe it's that there's actually some reverse discrimination. Who knows, right? But that's just looking at the averages, right? We want to do this at the individual player level. And so we don't just want to look at the averages, but we can also think that referees could affect a lot of other things, so not just fouls, but points, assists, and even wins. So what we're going to do is try to look at, okay, there's not just one referee on the court, and the data set they have didn't have what referee made the foul call. So what this paper did was it said, okay, what is the foul rate in this game specific to this race, right? And we're going to control for things like what was the percent of white referees in that game? Sorry, I mixed this up. What's the percent of white referees in this game? Was the player that the fouls were was called on in that game, or the specific player we're looking at? Were they black? Right. These are just indicators, one or zero, and then this is from 0 to 100 percentage, and then interact that. So one thing that we haven't talked too much about is interaction terms. So here, this beta 3 would be if a player is black, the increase in the foul rate they could expect per game is beta 3. The interpretation of beta 2 is if I go from, and I believe that they measure this as a percent, so it would be if the percent of white referees goes up by 1%, which actually doesn't make a lot of sense because I think there's 3 referees at a time, so if you had a 1 referee increase, it would actually be a 33%. So here's the impact of a 1% increase in the percent of referees that are white. Probably makes more sense to think about this times 33. Right? If I have 1 more white referee, that would increase it by 33%. And so 33 times beta 2 would be the increase in the foul rate from having 1 more one more white referee. And then if I have 1 more white referee, this is an increase of 33% times beta 1. But now I'm interacting with black player. This is if there's 1 more white referee and the player is black, beta 1 is the change in the foul rate. So if beta 1 is positive, that means that if the player is black and the percent of white referees goes up, that the foul rate for a black player goes up more than for just a white player. Right? Now we control for all these other things. Right? We've got game, team, referee characteristics. We've got player fixed effects. We've got all this different team year fixed, team by year, player effects, game effect, everything we can think about that we can control for. So we look at kind of this coefficient on the interaction, right? That's what we're going to focus on because this is telling us the additional increase in the foul rate if the player is black from having more white referees on the court. Okay? So that's going to tell us whether or not there's this additional racism going on. Right? I shouldn't say racism, but at the very least, implicit bias, right? So if we look at the coefficient on that, and we're looking at that for a few slightly different specifications, and I'll pull up the paper here in just a second. But here's our kind of different Y variables. So are they more likely to foul out? Are they more likely to have a higher personal foul rate? Are they more likely to have a higher flagrant foul rate? So on and so forth. Are they more likely to have more minutes in the game? When you think about it this way, if they're more likely to have a foul call, and then they're less likely to play more minutes. So then we would think the interaction term of that black player times percent white referees might be negative. And sure enough, and I think 9 is their preferred specification, it looks like there's an increase in the number of personal fouls and no change in flagrant fouls or technicals. So they're not kind of calling technicals or flagrants differently against black players, at least these additional white referees. They're not more likely to foul out, although they are more likely to get a foul called, and they're also less likely to play as many minutes, right? The number of minutes they play goes down. Because the number of minutes they play goes down, we can think about things like probably the number of points they score goes down, the number of free throw attempts goes down, and these aren't significant, but at least the points one is here at the 90% level, right? 1 star we said is 90% significance. 3 stars is 99. 2 stars is 95. Okay. So having this higher percent of white referees leads black players to experience the following. If we just look at the statistically significant ones, right? Fewer minutes, more personal fouls, fewer points, some evidence of more flagrant fouls. So if we look at flagrant fouls here, if you actually calculate if this is statistically significant, it's just barely outside the range. And for a lot of these specifications, it actually is significant at the 10% level. So it might be more likely to get a flagrant foul calling a black player if the percent of referees in the game is that are white or higher. So we have all these things occurring. What's actually interesting, I'll pull the paper here in a second, but the exact same is true if we look at the effect of having a higher percent of black referees on the fouls, personal fouls minutes, points of white players, right? So if the percent of black referees goes up, it's more likely that a white player has more personal fouls called on them. So we have kind of racial bias going both ways, which is kind of interesting. Or cross-race discrimination, if you want to think about it that way. It works both directions here, at least from this paper. So let's pull this paper up here because I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into it. And all these were kind of measured by minutes, right? So they were kind of accounting for the minutes that were played. Here it is. So this is the paper that's up on Canvas as our reading this week. Let's go down here. I always like to go right to the tables. So here's kind of the table I was just showing you. What if we look at percent black playing time? So that's not the one I want. I want the opposite race referees. So there's a little bit, they've got some kind of coaching differences here, but percent of white refs times percent. No, that's not what I want. I want the, here, this is kind of the interesting one, right? So if you look at extra fouls awarded against black players, we kind of look at our white referees here, and then black referees are these kind of rectangles. See, there's far more white referees who are more likely to call fouls on black players, far more black referees who are less likely to call fouls on black players, which implicitly means they're more likely to call fouls on white players. So we kind of see it on both sides in terms of like cross race discrimination. And let's see if there's any other table I wanted to mention here. I thought there was one. Oh, I thought this one is kind of interesting too. So if we look at the average point differential, when you have 0 white referees, the composition of the team could be the point differential kind of falls on either side. When you have 1 white referee, it looks like it's falling on either side as well, but it gets kind of steeper. Like if you notice, here it goes from 1 to -1. Here it's below 2 to something just above -2. Here it's 2 to -2. So the more white referees, winning margins of their own race are more likely to be kind of higher, right? So it's more likely the team that has a higher percent of white players wins by more points, right? 2 points as opposed to just under 2, as opposed to just under 1, as opposed to, right, kind of, here we actually have it really floating around 0. So if you look at this light gray or light blue area, that's the confidence interval, so it always includes 0 here, so there's no real effect when you have 0 kind of white referees. Is there another regression results we could kind of use to give us an example of something we look at our paper? So here, this is a kind of a nice table that just shows they're adding in additional kind of control variables every single time. So here they've got just the control for black player and white referee. Now they're adding in, or percent of white referees, they're adding in position, weight, height. Here they're adding in these additional variables. Now once they get to a certain point, the reason why they don't have to add this black player indicator and percent white referees is because they start to include things like player fixed effects and referee fixed effects, which means for every single player and every single referee in that game, they included an indicator for whether or not that player or referee was in the game. If they were, it was a 1. If not, it was a 0. So then that kind of accounts for the fact that that's no longer changing across these games. And so if you go to the preferred kind of column, that was 9. And then here, right, that was just basically the same thing. That's the coefficient on that interaction term. And then the rest of column 9 is just, if you, instead of looking at personal files, we'll look at all these other dependent or y variables. Okay? So looks like we got some evidence that there is some racial discrimination going on. This is a pretty well-known paper. The NBA really didn't like this. I believe, if I remember the story right, the NBA reproduced this and found that it just didn't exist for more recent years, but you know, it's the NBA. I don't think they necessarily made all their regression code and you know, all their data publicly available, while this paper does. So that is the reading for the week. Hopefully, kind of this summary in the slides, as well as kind of some of this discussion, helps you answer the weekly quiz question for this week, as I'll have a couple other questions as well. If you have any questions, like I said, please email me. I'll get those the data for the projects out pretty quickly. I have started kind of streaming these on Twitch, so I'll be live. I'm going to kind of tentatively plan on Monday and Tuesday every week to be live, do the live lectures at 1 o'clock or just after 1. So if I'm not on a ride at 1, I'll be there a little bit after. I kind of usually eat lunch and then kind of hop on afterwards, trying to keep a schedule amidst this quarantine. But that is it for week 10. I believe we've worked through every possible thing you could to be able to be able to work on homework 3. If you have any questions, the due date is kind of getting closer for that. I'm available to meet via Skype or kind of via email. Okay, that is the recording for week 10, lecture 2.